Over the last 25 years, the reputation of Mao Zedong has been seriously undermined by ever more extreme estimates of the numbers of deaths that he was supposedly responsible for. In his lifetime, Mao Zedong was hugely respected for the way that his socialist policies improved the welfare of the Chinese people, slashing the level of poverty and hunger in China and providing free health care and education. Mao's theories also gave great inspiration to those fighting imperialism around the world. It's probably this factor that explains the great deal of hostility towards him from the right. This is a tendency that is likely to grow more acute with the more apparent growth in strength of the Maoist movements in India and Nepal in recent years, as well as the continuing influence of Maoist movements in other parts of the world. Most of the attempts to undermine Mao's reputation center around the Great Leap Forward that began in 1958. It is this period that this article is primarily concerned with. The peasants had already started farming the land cooperatively in the 1950s. During the Great Leap Forward, they joined large communes consisting of thousands or tens of thousands of people. Large-scale irrigation schemes were undertaken to improve agricultural productivity. Mao's plan was to massively increase both agriculture and industrial production. It is argued that these policies led to a famine in the years 1959 to 61, although some believe the famine began in 1958. A variety of reasons are cited for the famine. For example, excessive grain procurement by the state or food being wasted due to free distribution in communal kitchens. It has also been claimed that the peasants neglected agriculture to work on the irrigation schemes or in the famous backyard furnaces or small-scale steel furnaces built in rural areas. Mao admitted that problems had occurred in this period. However, he blamed the majority of these difficulties on bad weather and natural disasters. He admitted that there had been policy errors too, which he took responsibility for. Official Chinese sources released after Mao's death suggest that 16.5 million people died in the Great Leap Forward. These figures were released during an ideological campaign by the government of Deng Xiaoping against the legacy of the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. However, there seems to be no way of independently authenticating these figures due to the great mystery about how they were gathered and preserved for 20 years before being released to the general public. American researchers managed to increase this figure to around 30 million by combining the Chinese evidence with extrapolations of their own from China's censuses from 1953 and 1964. Recently, Yang Cheng and Holiday, in their book Mao the Unknown Story, reported 70 million killed by Mao, including 38 million in the Great Leap Forward. Western writers on the subject have taken a completely disproportionate view of the period, mesmerized as they are by massive death toll figures from dubious sources. They concentrate only on policy excesses, and it is likely that their views on the damage that these did are greatly exaggerated. There has been a failure to understand how some of these policies developed in the Great Leap Forward actually benefited the Chinese people once the initial disruption was over. U.S. state agencies have provided assistance to those with a negative attitude to Maoism and communism in general throughout the post-war period. For example, the veteran historian of Maoism Roderick McFarker edited the China Quarterly in the 1960s. The magazine published allegations about a massive famine deaths that have been quoted ever since. It later emerged that this journal received money from a CIA-front organization, as McFarker admitted in a recent letter to the London Review of Books. Roderick McFarker states that he did not know the money was coming from the CIA while he was editing the China Quarterly. Those who have provided qualitative evidence, such as eyewitness accounts cited by Jasper Becker in his famous account in the period Hungry Ghosts, have not provided enough accompanying evidence to authenticate these accounts. Important documentary evidence quoted by Chang and Halliday concerning the Great Leap Forward is presented in a demonstrably misleading way. Evidence from the Deng Xiaoping regime, Mao, that millions died during the Great Leap Forward is not reliable. Evidence from peasants contradicts the claim that Mao was mainly to blame for the deaths that did occur during the Great Leap Forward period. U.S. demographers have tried to use death rate evidence and other demographic evidence from the official Chinese sources to prove the hypothesis that there was a massive death toll in the Great Leap Forward, i.e. the hypothesis that the largest famine of all time, or one of the largest famines of all time, took place during the Great Leap Forward. However, inconsistencies in the evidence and overall doubts about the sources of this evidence undermines the massive death toll hypothesis. The idea that Mao was responsible for genocide has been used as a springboard to rubbish everything that the Chinese people achieved during Mao's rule. However, even someone like the demographer Judith Bannister, one of the most prominent advocates of the massive death toll hypothesis, has to admit the successes of the Mao era. She writes how in 1973 to 75, life expectancy in China was higher than Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, and many countries in Latin America. In 1981, she co-wrote an article where she described the People's Republic of China as a superachiever in terms of mortality reduction, with life expectancy increasing by approximately 1.5 years per calendar year since the start of the communist rule in 1949. Life expectancy increased from 35 in 1949 to 65 in the 1970s when Mao's rule came to an end. To read many of the modern commentaries on Mao's China, you would get the impression that Mao's agricultural and industrial policies led to absolute economic disaster. Even more restrained commentators such as the economist Peter Nolan claim that the living standards did not rise in China during the post-revolutionary period until Deng Xiaoping took power. Of course, increases in living standards are not the sole reason for increases in life expectancy. However, it is absurd to claim that life expectancy could have raised so much during the Mao era with no increase in living standards. For example, it is claimed by many who have studied the figures released by Deng Xiaoping after Mao's death that per capita grain production did not increase at all during the Mao period. But how is it possible to reconcile such statistics with the figures on life expectancy that the same authors quote? Besides, with these figures are contradicted by other figures. Guo Xiutian, a former deputy in policy on law in the Chinese Ministry of Agriculture in the post-Mao era, gave a very different view of China's overall agricultural performance during the period before Deng's reforms. It is true that he writes that the agricultural production decreased in 5 years between 1949 and 1978 due to natural calamities and mistakes in the work. However, he states that during the 1949 to 1978 period, the per hectare yield of land sown with food crops increased by 145.9%, and the total food production rose 169.6%. During this period, China's population grew by 77.7%. On these figures, China's per capita food production grew from 204 kilograms to 328 kilograms in the period in question. Even according to figures released by the Deng Xiaoping regime, industrial production increased by 11.2% per year from 1952 to 1976, by 10% a year during the alleged catastrophe of the Cultural Revolution. In 1952, industry was 36% gross value of the national output in China. By 1975, industry was 72% and agriculture was 28%. It is quite obvious that Mao's supposedly disastrous socialist economic policies paved the way for the rapid, but inegalitarian and unbalanced economic development of the post-Mao era. There is a good argument to suggest that the policy of the Great Leap Forward actually did much to sustain China's overall economic growth after an initial period of disruption. At the end of the 1950s, it was clear that China was going to have to develop using its own resources without being able to use the large amount of machinery and technology know-how imported from the Soviet Union. In the late 1950s, China and the USSR were headed for a schism. Partly, this was the ideological fallout that occurred following the death of Stalin. There had been differences between Stalin and Mao. Among other things, Mao believed that Stalin mistrusted the peasants and overemphasized the development of heavy industry. It is important not to exaggerate the nature of these differences. However, Mao vehemently opposed the way Khrushchev denounced Stalin in 1956. Mao believed that Khrushchev was using the denunciation of Stalinism as a cover for the progressive ditching of socialist ideology and practice in the USSR. The split was due to the tendency of Khrushchev to try and impose the Soviets' own way of doing things on its allies. Khrushchev acted not in the spirit of socialist internationalism, rather in the spirit of treating economically less developed nations like client states. For a country like China that had fought so bitterly for its freedom from foreign domination, such a relationship could never have been acceptable. Mao could not have sold it to his people, even if he had wanted to. In 1960, the conflict between the two nations came to a head. The Soviets had been providing a great deal of assistance for China's industrialization program. In 1960, all Soviet technical advisors left the country. They took with them the blueprints of the various industrial plants that they had been planning to build. Mao made clear that from the start, the policy of the Great Leap Forward were about China developing a more independent economic policy. China's alternative to reliance on the USSR was a program for developing agriculture alongside the development of industry. In doing so, Mao wanted to use the resources that China could muster in abundance, labor, and popular enthusiasm. The use of these resources would make up for the lack of capital and advanced technology. Although problems and reversals occurred in the Great Leap Forward, it is fair to say that it had a very important role in the ongoing development of agriculture. Measures such as water conservancy and irrigation allowed for sustained increases in agricultural production. Once the period of bad harvest was over, they also helped the countryside to deal with the problems of drought. Flood defenses were also developed. Terracing helped gradually increase the amount of cultivated areas. Industrial development was carried out under the slogan, "Walking on two legs." This meant the development of small and medium-scale rural industry alongside the development of heavy industry, as well as the steel furnaces and many other workshops and factories were opened in the countryside. The idea was that this rural industry would meet the needs of the local population. Rural workshops supported efforts by the commune to modernize agricultural work methods. Rural workshops were very effective in providing the communes with fertilizer, tools, and other agricultural equipment and cement needed for water conservation schemes. Compared to the rigid, centralized economic system that tended to prevail in the Soviet Union, the Great Leap Forward was a supreme act of lateral thinking. Normally, cement and fertilizer, for example, would be produced in large factories in urban areas away from the rural areas that needed them. In a poor country, there would be the problem of obtaining the capital and machinery necessary to produce the industrial products such as these, using the most modern technique. And infrastructure linking the cities to towns would be needed to transport such products once they were made. This in itself would involve a vast expense. As a result of problems like these, the development in many poor countries is either very slow or does not occur at all. Rural industry established during the Great Leap Forward used labor-intensive rather than capital-intensive methods. As they were serving local needs, they were not dependent on the development of an expensive nationwide infrastructure of road and rail to transport finished goods. In fact, the supposedly wild, chaotic policies of the Great Leap Forward meshed together quite well with the problems of the first few years. Local cement production allowed water conservation schemes to be undertaken. Greater irrigation made it possible to spread more fertilizer. This fertilizer was, in turn, provided by the local factories. Greater agricultural productivity would free up more agricultural labor for the industrial manufacturing sector, facilitating the overall development of the country. This approach is often cited as an example of Mao's economic illiteracy. What about the division of labor and gains from the regional specialization, etc.? However, it was right for China as the positive effects of Mao's policies in terms of human welfare and economic development show. Agriculture and small-scale rural industry were not the only sectors to grow during China's socialist period. Heavy industry grew a great deal in this period too. Development such as the establishment of the Taichung oil field during the Great Leap Forward provided a great boost to the development of heavy industry. A massive oil field was developed in China. This was developed after the 1960s using the indigenous techniques rather than Soviet or Western techniques. Specifically, the workers used pressure from below to help extract the oil. They did not rely on constructing a multitude of derricks, as is the usual practice in oil fields. The argument about production figures belie the fact that the Great Leap Forward was at least as much about changing the way of thinking of the Chinese people as it was about industrial production. The so-called backyard furnaces, where peasants tried to produce steel in small rural foundries, became infamous for the low quality of steel they produced. But they were much more about training the peasants in the ways of industrial production as they were about generating steel for China's industry. It's worth remembering that the leaps Mao used to talk about were not leaps in the quantities of goods being produced, but the leaps in people's consciousness and understanding. Mistakes were made, and many must have been demoralized when they realized that some of the results of the Great Leap had been disappointing, but the success of the Chinese economy in the years to come shows that not all its lessons were wasted. Of course, to make such points is to go against the mainstream Western view that the Great Leap Forward was a disaster of world historical proportions. But what is the basis for this view? One way those who believe in the massive death toll thesis could prove their case would be to find credible qualitative evidence such as eyewitness or documentary evidence. The qualitative evidence that does exist is not convincing, however. Chinese history scholar Charles Riskin believes that a very serious famine took place, but states, in general, it appears that the indications of hunger and hardship did not approach the kinds of qualitative evidence of mass famine that have accompanied other famines of comparable, if not equal scale, including earlier famines in China. He points out that much of the contemporary evidence presented in the West tended to be discounted at the time as it emanated from right-wing sources that were hardly conclusive. He considers whether repressive policies by the Chinese government prevented information about the famine getting out, but only states whether it is a sufficient explanation is doubtful. There remains something of a mystery here. There are authors such as Roderick McFarquhar, Jasper Becker, and Yang Chang who certainly do assert that the evidence they have seen proves the massive famine thesis. It is true that their main works on these issues do cite sources for this evidence. However, they do not make it sufficiently clear in these books why they believe these sources are authentic. Therefore, it remains an open question why the accounts presented by these authors should be treated as certain fact in the West. In his famous 1965 book on China, A Curtain of Ignorance, Felix Green says that he traveled through areas of China in 1960 where food rationing was very tight, but he did not see mass starvation. He also cites other eyewitnesses who say the same kind of thing. It is likely that, in fact, the famine did occur in some areas. However, Green's observations indicate that it was not a nationwide phenomenon on the apocalyptic scale suggested by Jasper Becker and others. Mass hunger was not occurring in the areas he traveled through, although famines may have been occurring elsewhere. Why are the accounts of people like Becker believed so readily when the account of Felix Green and others he cites is discounted? Of course, the sympathy of Green for Mao's regime may be raised in connection with this, and it might be suggested that he distorted the truth for political reasons. But Becker, McFarquhar, and Yang Chang have their own perspectives on issues too. Could anyone seriously doubt that these authors are not fairly staunch anti-communists? Before addressing the question of the authentication of sources, the context for the discussion of these issues needs to be set. Communism is a movement that generates a massive amount of opposition. Western countries wage an intensive propaganda war against communism. In power, communist governments disposed large numbers of people of their capital and land. The whole landlord and business class was robbed of its social power and status across Asia and Europe. Unsurprisingly, this generated much bitterness. A large number of well-educated people who were born in these countries had and still have the motivation to discredit communism. It is not paranoia to ask those that write about the communist era to take pains to ensure that their sources are reporting fact and are not providing testimony that has been distorted or slanted by anti-communist bias. In addition, the U.S. government did have an interest in putting out negative propaganda about Chinese communism and communism in general. Too often, discussion of this is dismissed as conspiracy theories, and the evidence about what really happened does not get discussed very widely. However, covert attempts by the U.S. to discredit communism are a matter of record. U.S. intelligence agencies often sought out connection with those who published work about communist regimes, not be thought of as the people that they sought in connection were simply hacks paid to churn out cheap sensationalism. Well, far from it. For example, the China Quarterly published many articles in the 1960s which are still frequently cited as evidence of living conditions in China and the successes or otherwise of government policies in that country. In 1962, it published an article by Joseph Alsop that alleged that Mao was attempting to wipe out 1/3 of the population through starvation to facilitate his economic plans. This article is cited in all seriousness to provide contemporary evidence of massive death toll hypothesis in many later works on the subject. For example, in the article Famine in China that it is discussed below. The editor of the China Quarterly was Roderick McFarquhar, who went on to write many important works on China's communist government. McFarquhar edited Volume 14 of the Cambridge History of China, which covered the period 1949 to 1965. He wrote The Origins of the Cultural Revolution, which includes a volume on the events of 56 and 57, as well as a volume on the Great Leap Forward, which puts forward massive death toll thesis. He also edited Mao's Secret Speeches, printed in the pages of the China Quarterly, is a statement that it was published by the Information Bulletin Limited on behalf of the Congress for Cultural Freedom. On the 13th of May 1967, the CCF issued a press release admitting that it was funded by the CIA, following an expose in Ramparts magazine. Roderick McFarker was questioned about it. When I was asked to be the founder editor of the China Quarterly, it was explained to me that the mission of the CCF was to encourage Western intellectuals to form a community committed to the free exchange of ideas. The aim was to provide some kind of organizational counter to the Soviet efforts to attract Western intellectuals into various front organizations. All I was told about funding was that the CCF was backed by a wide range of foundations, including notably Ford, and the fact that, of these, the Farfield Foundation was a CIA front was not disclosed. In a 26th of January 2006 edition of the London Review of Books, McFarker writes of the 1960 inaugural issues of the China Quarterly, of which I was then editor. He also writes that secret monies from the CIA, from the Farfield Foundation via the Congress for Cultural Freedom, the parent of the CQ, Encounter, and many other magazines provided part of the funding for the CQ, something which I did not know until the public revelations of the late 1960s. The issue goes beyond those. Like McFarker, who worked for the periodicals connected with the CCF, it also alleged that other magazines received funding that emanated from the CIA more generally. For example, Victor Marchetti, a former staff officer in the office for the director of the CIA, wrote that the CIA set up the Asia Foundation and subsidized it to the tune of $8 million a year to support the work of anti-communist academia in various Asian countries to disseminate throughout Asia a negative vision of mainland China, North Vietnam, and North Korea. Of course, the issue is not black and white. For example, McFarker also states that he allowed a wide range of views from different sides of the political spectrum to be aired in his journal. He argues that Alsop's article would have been published elsewhere, even if he had rejected it, and that he did publish replies to it which were negative about Alsop's thesis. This may be true. However, those like McFarker were publishing the kind of things that the CIA might be thought to, and in general, look favorably upon. Otherwise, why would the CIA have put money in for it? The key point is that these people had a source of Western state funding that others with a different viewpoint lacked. In the last few years, a new generation of writers has published alleged eyewitness accounts and documentary evidence for the massive death toll hypothesis. The key issue with the evidence is the authentication of sources. These authors do not present sufficient evidence in the works cited in the article to show that the sources are authentic. Jasper Becker, in his book on the Great Leap Forward, Hungry Ghosts, cites a great deal of evidence of mass starvation and cannibalism in China during the Great Leap Forward. It should be noted that this evidence that has only emerged in the 1990s. Certainly, the more lurid stories of cannibalism are not corroborated by any source that appeared at the actual time of the Great Leap Forward, or indeed for many years later. Many of the accounts of mass starvation cannibalism that Becker uses come from a 600-page document, 30 Years in the Countryside. Becker says it was a secret official document that was smuggled out of China in 1989. Becker writes that his sources for Hungry Ghosts include documents smuggled out of China in 1989 by intellectuals going into exile. The reader needs to be told how people who were apparently dissidents fleeing from the country during a crackdown were able to smuggle out official documents regarding events 30 years before. Also, Becker should have discussed more generally why he believes 30 Years in the Countryside and other texts are authentic. In 2001, Becker reviewed the Tiananmen Papers in the London Review of Books. The Tiananmen Papers are purportedly inter-party documents which were smuggled out of the country by a dissident. They supposedly shed light on the party leadership thinking at the time of the Tiananmen Square massacre. In his review, Becker seriously discusses the possibility that these papers might be forgeries. In Hungry Ghosts, Becker needed to say why he thought the documents he was citing in his own book were genuine, despite believing that other smuggled official documents might be inauthentic. Similarly, Becker cites a purported internal Chinese army journal from 1961 as evidence of a massive humanitarian disaster during the Great Leap Forward. The reports in this journal do indeed allude to a fairly significant disaster which is affecting the morale of Chinese troops. However, is this journal a genuine document? The journals were released by the U.S. Department of State in 1963 and was published in a collection by the Hoover Institution entitled The Politics of the Chinese Red Army in 1966. According to the British Daily Telegraph newspaper, the journal, have been in American hands for some time, although nobody will discuss how they were acquired. Becker and many other writers on the Great Leap Forward who have cited these journals need to state why they regard them as authentic. Becker's book also uses eyewitness accounts of hunger in the Great Leap Forward. During the mid-90s, he interviewed people in mainland China as well as Hong Kong and Chinese immigrants in the West. He states in his book that mainland China was rarely, if ever, allowed to speak freely to the peasants. Local officials coached the peasants before the interview, sat down with it during, and answered some of the questions for them. Given that there was a good chance that these officials were trying to slant evidence in favor of the negative Deng Xiaoping line on the Great Leap Forward, it is surely important that the reader is told which of the interviews cited in the book were conducted under these conditions and which were not. Becker does not do this in Hungry Ghosts. Nowhere in his book does he go into sufficient detail to demonstrate to the reader that these accounts he cites in this book are authentic. For a few years, Hungry Ghosts was the preeminent text as far as critics of Mao were concerned. However, in 2005, Mao the Unknown Story was published and very heavily promoted in the West. Its allegations are, if anything, even more extreme than Becker's book. Of the 70 million deaths the book ascribes to Mao, 38 million are meant to have taken place during the Great Leap Forward. This book relies heavily on an unofficial collection of Mao's speeches and statements which were supposedly recorded by his followers and which found their way to the West by means that are unclear. Now, authors often use materials from the collection and try to demonstrate Mao's fanaticism and lack of concern for human life. They are a group of texts that became newly available in the 1980s courtesy of the Center for Chinese Research Materials in the U.S. Some of these texts were translated into English and published in Mao's Secret Speeches. In this volume, Timothy Cheek writes an essay assessing the authenticity of the text. He writes, "The precise provenance of these volumes, which have arrived through various channels, cannot be documented." Timothy Cheek argues that the texts are likely to be authentic for two reasons. Firstly, because some of the texts that the CCRM received were previously published in mainland China in other editions. Secondly, because the texts appear in one volume received by the CCRM, also appears in at least one other volume received by the CCRM. It is not obvious to people why these two facts provide strong evidence of the general authenticity of the texts. Perhaps more importantly, Chang and Halliday quote passages from these texts in a misleading way in their chapter on the Great Leap Forward. Chang claims that in 1958, Mao clamped down on what he called people roaming the countryside uncontrolled. In the next sentence, the authors claim that the traditional possibility of escaping a famine by fleeing to a place where there was food was now blocked off. But the part of the secret speech in which Mao supposedly complains about people roaming around uncontrolled has nothing to do with preventing population movement in China. When the full passage, which the authors selectively quote from, is read, it can be seen that the authors are being misleading. What Mao is actually meant to have said is as follows. Someone from an APC, an agricultural producers cooperative, Joseph Ball, in Handan, drove a cart to the Anshan steel mill and wouldn't leave until given some iron. In every place, there are so many people roaming around uncontrolled. This must be banned completely. We must work out an equilibrium between levels, with each level reporting to the next higher level, APCs to their counties, counties to the prefectures, prefectures to the provinces. This is called socialist order. What Mao is talking about here is the campaign to increase steel production, partly through the use of small-scale rural production. Someone without authority was demanding iron from Anshan to help their cooperatives meet their steel production quota. Mao seems to be saying that this spontaneous approach was wrong. He seems to be advocating a more hierarchical socialist planning system where people have to apply to higher authorities to get the raw materials they need to fulfill production targets. This sounds very unlike Mao, but that is by the by. He's clearly not advocating a general ban on all Chinese people traveling around the country here. A second seriously misleading quotation comes at the end of the chapter on the Great Leap Forward. First, Chang and Halliday write, "We can now say with assurance how many people Mao is ready to dispense with." This paragraph then gives some examples of alleged quotes by Mao on how many Chinese deaths would be acceptable in time of war. The next paragraph begins, "Nor was Mao just thinking about a war situation." Then they quote Mao at the Wuchang conference saying, "Working like this with all the projects, half of China may well have to die." This quotation appears to be heading of Chang and Halliday chapter on the Great Leap Forward. The way the authors present this quotation looks as if Mao was saying that it might be needed or necessary for half of China to die to realize his plans to increase industrial production. But it's obvious from the actual text of the speech that what Mao was doing was warning of the dangers of overwork and overenthusiasm in the Great Leap Forward, while using a fair bit of hyperbole. Mao is making it clear that he does not want anyone to die as a result of the industrialization drive. In this part of the discussion, Mao talks about the idea of developing all the major industries and agriculture in one fell swoop. The full text of the passage that the authors selectively quote is as follows. "In this kind of situation, I think if we do all the things simultaneously, half of China's population unquestionably will die, and if it's not half, it'll be a third, or 10%, a death toll of 50 million. When people died in Guangxi, wasn't Chen Menyuan discussed? If with a death toll of 50 million you didn't lose your jobs, I at least should lose mine. Whether I would lose my head would be open to question. And Hui wants us to do so many things. It's quite all right to do a lot, but make it a principle to have no deaths." Then, in a few sentences later, Mao says, "As to 30 million tons of steel, do we really need that much? Are we able to produce that much? How many people do we need to mobilize? Could it lead to deaths?" It is very important that a full examination of the sources Chang and Halliday have used for this book is made. This is a call that has been made elsewhere. Nicholas D. Kristof's review of the book in the New York Times brought up some interesting questions. Kristof talks about Mao's English teacher, Zhang Huaixi. Mao attempted to learn English in his adult life, who Chang and Halliday cite as one of the people they interviewed for the book. However, Zhang told Kristof, who was one of her friends, that though she met with the two authors, she declined to be interviewed and provided them with no substantial information. Kristof calls for the authors to publish their sources on the web so that they can be assessed for fairness. There were some proponents of the massive death toll story in the 1960s. However, as Felix Green pointed out in A Curtain of Ignorance, anti-communists in the 1950s and early 1960s made allegations about massive famines in China virtually every year. The story about the Great Leap Forward was only really taken seriously in the 1980s when the new Chinese leadership began to back the idea. It was this that has really given credibility to the West, to those such as Becker and Yang Chang. The Chinese leadership began its attack on the Great Leap Forward in 1979. Deng moved against Mao supporters, directing the official press to attack them. This took the form of an ideological campaign against ultra-leftism. As Messinier says in his study of the Deng Xiaoping era, multitudes of scholars and their theoreticians were forced to expand upon the petty bourgeois social and ideological roots of the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. The reason for this vilification of the Great Leap Forward had much to do with the post-Mao power struggles and the struggle to roll back the socialist policies of 49 to 76. After Mao's death in 76, Hua Guofan had come to power on a platform of upholding every word and policy made by Mao. Deng Xiaoping badly needed a political justification for his usurpation of Hua in 1978 and his assumptions of leadership. Deng's stated stance of Mao being 70% right and 30% wrong was a way of distinguishing his own pragmatic approach to history and ideology from his predecessors. The post-market policies of Deng implemented suggested that he actually believed that Mao was about 80% wrong. The Chinese Party did everything it could to promote the notion that the Great Leap Forward was a catastrophe caused by ultra-leftist policies. Marshal Yi Yanjiang, in an important speech in 1979, talked of the disasters caused by leftist errors in the Great Leap Forward. In 1981, the Chinese Communist Party resolution on party history spoke of serious losses to our country and the people between 1959 and 1961. Academics joined in the attack. In 1981, Professor Liu Zhang, the director of the Institute of Population Research at the People's University, gave selected death rate figures for 1954 to 1978. These figures were given at a public academic gathering, which drew much attention in the West. The figures he gave for 1958 to 1961 indicated that 16.5 million excess deaths had occurred during the period. At the same time, Sun Yifeng, a prominent Chinese economist, publicly drew attention to these figures, stating that the high price was paid in blood for the mistakes of the Great Leap Forward. As well as the internal party struggle, Deng wanted to revise virtually all of Mao's positive achievements in the name of introducing capitalism or socialism with Chinese characteristics, as he described it. Attacking the Great Leap Forward helped provide the ideological justification for reversing Mao's leftist policies. Deng dissolved the agricultural communes in the early 1980s. In the years following the Great Leap Forward, the communes had begun to provide welfare services like free healthcare and education. The breakup of the commune meant that this ended. In an article about the Great Leap Forward, Huan Dongping, an assistant professor at the Warren Wilson College, described a humorous report in the New York-based Chinese newspaper, The World Journal, about a farmer of Henan province who was unable to pay medical bills to get his infected testicles treated. Tortured by the pain, he cut them off with a knife and almost killed himself. This kind of incident is the real legacy of Deng Xiaoping's reforms in the countryside. It is often said that Deng's agricultural reforms improved the welfare of the peasantry. It is true that the breaking up of the communes led to a 5-year period of accelerated agricultural production. But this was followed by 5 years of decline in per capita food production. Despite this decline, Western commentators tend to describe the breakup of the communes as an unqualified economic success. In fact, breaking up the peasant communes created sources of real hardship for the peasants. By encouraging the Chinese ruling class to describe the Great Leap Forward as a disaster that killed millions, Deng was able to develop a political line that made his regressive politics in the countryside seem legitimate. For Deng's line to prevail, he needed to prove that the mass deaths happened from 1959 to 61. But also that these were mainly the result of policy errors. After the Great Leap Forward, the official Chinese government line on the famine was that 70% due to natural disasters and 30% due to human error. This verdict was reversed by the Deng Xiaoping regime. In the 1980s, they claimed the problems was caused 30% by natural disasters, 70% by human error. But surely, if Mao's actions had led to the deaths of millions of peasants, the peasants would have realized what was going on. However, the evidence is that they did not blame Mao for most of the problems that occurred during the Great Leap Forward. Long after Mao's death, Professor Han Zhongping traveled to Shandong and Henan, where the worst famine conditions appeared in 1959 to 61. Hendong found that most of the farmers he questioned favored the first interpretation of the events rather than the second. That is to say, they did not think that Mao was mainly to blame for the problems they suffered during the Great Leap Forward. This was not to say that tragic errors did not occur. Zhongping wrote of the introduction of the communist eating in the rural communes. To begin with, this was a very popular policy among the peasants. Indeed, in 1958, many farmers report that they had never eaten so well in their lives. The problem was that this new seemingly abundance led to carelessness in the harvesting and consumption of food. People seem to have started assuming that the government could guarantee food supplies and that they did not have responsibility for themselves for food security. Given the poverty of China in the late 50s, this was an error that was bound to lead to serious problems, and the communist leadership should have taken quicker steps to rectify it. 3 years of awful natural disasters made things much worse. Solidarity between commune members and the worst affected regions broke down as individuals tried to seize crops before they were harvested. Again, this practice made a bad situation worse. However, it must be stressed that the farmers themselves did not tell Huan Dongping that the errors of the organization of the communal eating were the main cause of the famine they suffered. Han Dongping himself severely criticizes Mao for the consequences of his hasty policies during the Great Leap Forward. However, he also writes, "I have interviewed numerous workers and farmers in Shandong, Henan, and I have never met one farmer or worker who said that Mao was bad. I also talked to one scholar in Henhai, where the famine was alleged to have been the most serious. has happened to grow up in the rural areas and had been doing research in Anhui. He never met one farmer that said Mao was bad, nor a farmer who said Deng Xiaoping was good. It may be argued that Han Dongping, at least partial sympathy for Mao, might have colored his interpretations of what he heard from the peasants. However, it must also be noted that two of his grandparents died of hunger-related diseases during the Great Leap Forward, and Han Dongping often sounds more critical of Mao's policies in this period than the peasants he is interviewing. The relative sympathy of the peasants for Mao when recalling the Great Leap Forward must call into question the demographic evidence that indicates tens of millions of people starved to death at the time. Western academics seem united on the validity of this evidence. Even those who query it, like Carl Riskin, always end up insisting that all available evidence indicates a famine of huge proportions occurred in this period. In fact, there is certainly evidence from a number of sources that a famine occurred in this period, but the key question is, was it a famine that killed 30 million people? This really would have been unprecedented, although we are not used to reading newspaper headlines like tens of millions face starvation in Africa and famine. It is unheard of for tens of millions to actually die in a famine. For example, the Bangladesh famine of 74 to 75 is remembered as a deeply tragic event in the nation's history. However, the official death toll of Bangladesh famine was 30 million out of a single-year population of 76 million, though unofficial sources put the death toll at 100,000. Compare this to an alleged death toll of 30 million out of a single-year population calculated around 660 to 670 million for the Great Leap Forward period. Proportionally speaking, the death toll in the Great Leap Forward is meant to be approximately 35 times higher than the estimated death toll for the Bangladesh famine. It is rather misleading to say that all available evidence demonstrates the validity of the massive death thesis. The real truth is that all these estimates of tens of millions of Great Leap Forward deaths rely on figures for death rates for the 1950s and early 1960s. There is only one certain corroboration for those figures from other statistics for the period. The problem is that the death rate figures for the period 1940 to 82, like most Chinese demographic information, was regarded as a state secret by China's government until the early 1980s. As we shall see, uncertainty about how these were gathered seriously undermines their status as concrete evidence. It was only in 1982 that the death rate figures for the 1950s and 1960s were released. They purportedly show that the death rate rose from 10.8 per thousand in 1957 to 25.4 per thousand in 1960, dropping to 14.2 per thousand in 1961 and 10 per thousand in 1962. These figures appear to show approximately 15 million excess deaths due to famine from 1958 to 1961. Chinese data on famine deaths was used by a group of U.S. demographers in their own work on the subject. These demographers were Ansley Cole, John Arid, and Judith Bannister. They can be said to be the three people who first popularized the massive death toll hypothesis in the West. Ansley Cole was a very influential figure in American demography. He was employed by the Office of Population Research, which was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation in the 1980s when he was publishing his work on China. John Arid was a research specialist on China at the U.S. Bureau of Census. In 1990, he wrote a book published by the American Enterprise Institute, which is a body that promotes neoliberal policies. This book was called The Slaughter of the Innocents, which was a critique of China's one-child birth control policy. Judith Bannister was another worker at the U.S. Bureau of Census. She was given time off for her employment there to write a book that included a discussion of the Great Leap Forward deaths. John Arid read her book pre-publication and gave her advice. Judith Bannister produced figures that appear to show 30 million excess deaths in the Great Leap Forward. This was nearly twice the figure indicated by official Chinese statistics. She believes the official statistics underestimate the total mortality because of underreporting of deaths by Chinese population during the period in question. Bannister calculates the total number of underreported deaths in this period, first by calculating the total number of births between two censuses of 1953 and 1964. She does this using data derived from the census and the data from a retrospective fertility survey carried out in 1982. Participants of the survey were asked to describe the number of babies they had given birth to between 1940 and 1981. Once the population of 1953 and 1964 is known, the total number of births between the 2 years is known. It is possible to calculate the number of deaths that would have occurred during the period. She uses this information to calculate the total number of deaths for the 11-year period. This is actually higher than the official death rates show. To estimate how many of these deaths occurred in the Great Leap Forward, Bannister returns to the official Chinese death rate statistics. She asserts that these figures indicate the actual trend of deaths in China in this period, even though they were too low in absolute terms. For example, she assumes that the official death rate of 25 per thousand in 1960 does indeed indicate that there was a huge increase in death rate that occurred in 1960. However, she combines this with her estimates of underreporting of deaths in the period 1953 to 1964 to come up with a figure of 45 deaths per thousand in 1960. In years which no famine is alleged, the death toll also increases using this method. In 1957, for example, she increases the death rate from the official figure of 10.8 per thousand to 18 per thousand. Bannister then compares the revised death rates in good years with the revised death rates in alleged famine years. Bannister is then able to come up with an estimate of 30 million deaths, excess deaths, during the Great Leap Forward. A variety of Chinese figures are quoted to back up this thesis that a massive famine occurred. Statistics that purport to show that Mao was to blame for it are also quoted. They include figures supposedly given from a provincial breakdown of the increased death rates in the Great Leap Forward, figures showing a massive decrease in grain production during the Great Leap Forward, and also figures that apparently showed that bad weather was not to blame for the famine. These figures were all released in the early 1980s at the time of Deng's reforms. But how trustworthy are any of these figures? As we have seen, they were released during the early 1980s at a time of acute criticism of the Great Leap Forward and the People's Communes. China under Deng was a dictatorship that tried to rigorously control the flow of information to its people. It would be reasonable to assume that a government that continually interfered with the reporting of public affairs by the media would also interfere with the production of statistics when it suited them. John Aird, writing in 1982, stated that the main reason so few national population data appear in Chinese sources, however, is central censorship. No national population figures can be made public without prior authorization by the State Council. Even officials of the SSB, the State Statistics Bureau, cannot use such figures until they have been cleared. Of particular interest is the question of the circumstances under which the death rate figures were arrived at by the State Statistics Bureau. The figures given for total deaths during the Great Leap Forward by U.S. and Chinese academics all depends on the key death rate statistic for the years in question. Of course, if we knew in detail how information about the death rates gathered during the Great Leap Forward, we might be able to now be certain that it is accurate. The problem is that this information is not available. We have to just take the Chinese government's word for it that their figures are true. Moreover, statements provided by Aird and Bannister indicate that they believe the death rate figures were estimates and not based on an actual count of recorded deaths. Aird states that the official vital rates, birth and death rates of the crisis years of the Great Leap Forward must be estimates. Their basis are not known. Bannister writes that China did try to start vital registration in 1954, but it was very incomplete. She writes that if the system of death registration was used as a basis for any of the estimated death rates for 1955 through 1957, the rates were derived only from those localities that had set up the system, which would tend to be more advanced or more urbanized locations. Bannister suggests that the situation did not improve very much during or after the Great Leap Forward. She writes, in the late 1960s and most prior years, the permanent population registration and reporting system may have been so incomplete and uneven that the national or provincial statistics personnel had to estimate all or a part of their totals. In particular, in the 1950s, the permanent population registration and reporting system was only beginning to be set up. And at first, it did not cover the entire population. All the national population totals were for the 1950s, except the census total, which were probably based on incomplete local reports supplemented by estimates. She also writes that in all years prior to 1973 and 75, the PRC's data on crude death rates, infant mortality rates, and expectation of life at birth and causes of death were non-existent. useless, or at best, underestimates of actual mortality. The reader searches the work of Aird, Cole, and Bannister in vain for some indication as to why they can so confidently assert the figures for tens of millions of deaths in the Great Leap Forward based on official death rate figures. These authors do not know how these figures were gathered, and especially in Bannister's case, they appear to have a little faith in them. Some demographers have tried to calculate infant death rates to provide evidence for the massive death toll hypothesis. However, the evidence they come up with tends to muddy the picture rather than providing corroboration for the evidence from death rates. One calculation of the deaths made by this method appears in the 1984 article Famine in China. This article reviewed the previous work of Aird, Cole, and Bannister. It accepted the contention of these latter authors that a massive level of death had occurred overall during the Great Leap Forward. However, the authors also tried to calculate separate figures for child and adult deaths in this period. The evidence this later article tries to put together is very frequently quoted by those writing about the era. The authors of Famine in China calculate the infant deaths using the 1982 retrospective fertility survey. They use this survey to calculate the number of births in each year of the Great Leap Forward. Once the number of births is estimated for each year, it is possible to calculate how many of those were born in the years 1958 to 1962. They survive to be counted in the census of 1964. This can be compared with the survivorship rates of babies born in the years when no famine was alleged. They use model life tables to calculate how many of the babies dying before the census died in each famine year. They then convert this figure to a figure for the number of deaths of those aged under 10 in each of the famine years. This final figure is arrived at by using life tables in period mortality levels. The authors of this article argue that the famine began in 1958-59. They calculate that 4,268,000 excess deaths for those aged under 10 occurred in this period, which represents a doubling of the death rate for this age group. Yet, at the same time, there was an excess death figure of only 216,000 for those over 10. In a country of over 600 million, this figure was surely well within any reasonable margin of error. The explanation is that in the absence of effective rationing, children were left to starve in this period. But in famines, it is traditionally both the very young and the very old who both suffer. But in this year, only the young suffer. Then in 1960 to 61, the number of excess deaths for under 10s is reduced to 558,000, whereas the number for over 10s shoots up to 9 million. Even more bizarrely, 4,424,000 excess child deaths are calculated for the 1961 to 62, but no excess deaths for those over 10 are calculated to have occurred in this period. There is clearly a paradox here. According to the death rate provided by the Chinese, 1960 was the worst calendar year of the famine. The death rate increased from 10.8 per thousand before the famine to 25.4 thousand in 1960, which was far and away the peak year for famine deaths. If this was true, then we would expect 1959-60 and 60-61 to be the worst fiscal years in terms of number of child deaths. Yet, according to the authors, only 24.6% of excess child deaths occurred in these fiscal years, as opposed to 98.75% of the excess deaths of those aged 10 or over. It is hard to understand why there would have been such a large infant mortality rate in 58 to 59. Everyone agrees that 58 was a bumper harvest year, even if grain production figures were exaggerated. The bulk of the Chinese crop is harvested in the autumn, so it's difficult to see why the massive deaths would have begun at the end of 1958, or even why so many deaths would have occurred in the first 3 months of 59. As we have seen, Han Dongping, assistant professor of political science at the Warren Wilson College, questioned the peasants in Shandong and Henan where the worst effects of the problems in the 59 to 61 period were felt. They stated that they had never eaten so well as they had after the bumper harvest of 1958. Official death rate figures show a slight increase from 10.8 per thousand in 1952 to 12 per thousand in 1958. Why were the infant deaths so much worse than in the fiscal year of 1958-59, according to the figures that are presented by demographers? Why did the situation improve in the year of the alleged Black Famine? This, it is claimed by the authors of Famine in China, is because a rationing system was introduced that assisted all of those of working age and below, but left the old to die. Certainly there is some evidence that the young of the working age received higher rations than the old, because the young were performing manual labor. However, in 1961 to 62, when the authors alleged the famine was still occurring, the death rate for under 10s shot up to 4,424,000, and the death rate for those over 10 reduces to 0. It is alleged that the rationing was relaxed during this period, allowing the young to die. It was not explained why no old people died during the period as well. Are the authors claiming that in famines, Chinese families would let their children die, but not the old people? The authors provide no evidence for this counterintuitive implication of their analysis. They try to back up their thesis with figures that claim to show a reduction in the number of those in older age groups between the two censuses, 1953 and 64. The argument is that in a country that was developing a healthy way, the numbers of old people in the population should grow rather than fall. They argue that the figures for China in this period show a decline in the numbers of old people due to the way in which they were denied rations during the Great Leap Forward. But the figures they quote are not consistent with mass deaths caused by a shortfall in rations for all people over a certain age. The authors state that age-specific growth rates fall for males aged over 45 and for females over 65 between the two censuses. What kind of rationing system would have led to such a disparity? One that provided sustenance to women aged 45 to 65, but not men of the same age. Besides, even after the age of 65, the figures for women are not consistent. The number of those aged 75 to 79 grew by 0.51% on the figures presented. This figure compares well with the growth rates of age groups under 65. For example, the number of 20 to 24 years old grew by 0.57%, and the numbers of 45 to 49-year-olds by 0.55%. The figures for women do not show a pattern consistent with a rationing system that discriminated against the old. Faulty source statistics are a far more plausible explanation for the confusing figures the authors present than their own difficult-to-swallow hypothesis about rationing. This article does not dispel doubts about massive famine deaths. It is true the authors of the article can point to some corroboration of evidence they present. For example, there is a reasonable correlation between the number of births given by the fertility census of 1982 and the birth rate figures allegedly gathered in the years 53 to 64. Also, there is reasonable corroboration between the survivorships of birth co-hosts born in the famine to the 64 consensus and their survivorship in the 1982 census. If different pieces of evidence supposedly gathered independently of each other correlate, then this provides some evidence that the author's hypothesis is true, in which case there might seem to be a stalemate. On the other hand, there was a correlation between this evidence. On the other, there was a huge mismatch between child mortality and adult mortality in alleged famine years. However, we must remember the concerns that exist about the general validity of population statistics released by the Chinese government after the death of Mao. In the light of these uncertainties, the correlations between the birth rate figures and the fertility survey figures are not really decisive. Correlation between Chinese population figures occur elsewhere and have been considered by demographers. Bannister speaks in another connection of the possibility of a mutual independence of Chinese demographic surveys that were supposedly conducted independently of each other. She notes that the census figures for 1982 and the population figures derived from the vital registration in 1982 were supposedly gathered independently. However, there is an extremely great correlation between the two figures. The possibility of such mutual interdependence between the fertility survey figures and the birth rate figures should not be ruled out. In addition, it must be said the authors of Famine in China only present one estimate of the survivorship of babies born during the Great Leap Forward. Ansley Cole's article, published in the same year, shows a reasonably significant but much smaller dip in the survivorship in the years 1958 to 59 to the 1982 census that is shown in Famine in China. This would indicate far less excess infant deaths in the years in question. In addition, Cole's figures show no dip in the survivorship of babies born in the 61 to 62 to the 1982 census, in contrast to the figures presented in Famine in China. Doubts about the survivorship evidence combined with doubts about the death rate evidence greatly undermine the established beliefs about what happened in the Great Leap Forward. Overall, a review of the literature leaves the impression that not a very well substantiated hypothesis of a massive death toll has been transformed into an absolute certainty without any real justification. A final piece of evidence from the massive death toll thesis comes from raw census data. That is to say, we can just look at how the large numbers of those born in 59 to 61 and surviving to a subsequent census is compared to the surrounding years in which no famine has been alleged. We can get this evidence from the various censuses taken since the Great Leap Forward. These indeed show a large shortfalls in the size of cohorts of those born in famine years compared to other years. Even if it was granted that such shortfalls did occur, they do not necessarily indicate massive numbers of deaths. Birth rate figures released by the Deng Xiaoping regime show that massive decreases in fertility during the Great Leap Forward. It is possible to hypothesize that there were a very large shortfall in birth without this necessarily indicating that millions died as well. Of course, there had to be some reason why fertility dropped off so rapidly, if this is indeed what did happen. Clearly, hunger would have played a part in this. People would have postponed having children because of worries about having another mouth to feed until food was available, improved. Clearly, if people were having such concerns, this would have indicated an increase in malnutrition, which would have led to some increase in the child mortality. However, this is in no way proves the worst famine in world history occurred under Mao. The Dutch famine of 44 to 45 led to a fertility decline of 50%. The Bangladesh famine of 74 to 75 also led to near 50% decrease in the birth rate. This is similar to figures released in the Deng Xiaoping era for the decline in the fertility of the Great Leap Forward. Although both Bangladesh and Dutch famines were deeply tragic, they did not give rise to the kind of wild mortality figures talked about in reference to the Great Leap Forward. As was noted above, in Bangladesh, tens of thousands died, not tens of millions. However, we should not automatically assume that evidence from the single-year age distributions are correct. There was a general problem with all efforts to derive information from single-year age distributions from 1953 to 64 census. These figures only appeared in early 1980s, when all the figures that blamed Mao for killing millions emerged. Consensus afterwards, example 82 to 1990, continue to show shortfalls, but again caution should be exercised. Bannister speaks of consistency in the age-sex structures between the three censuses of 1953, 1964, and 1982, with very plausible survival patterns for each age group from census to census. She writes, "It is surprising that China's three censuses appear to be almost equally complete. One would have expected that the first two counts missed many people since they were conducted in less than ideal circumstances. The 1953 enumeration was China's first modern census taken with only 6 months of preparation, soon after the State Statistics Bureau was established. The 1964 census was taken in great secrecy and included a question on people's class origins that might have prompted some to avoid being counted." Ping-Ti Ho of the University of British Columbia wrote that the 1953 census was based, at least in part, on estimates, not the counting of population, and was not census in the technical definition of the term. Yet the age structure of this census correlates extremely well with all the subsequent consensuses. Adding to the model, John Aird received evidence about the age-sex distribution in 1953 census from Chinese non-official academic sources in the 1960s. He found these figures unreliable, stating that the numbers for 5 to 24-year-olds are lower than would be expected, and the figures for those aged over 75 are much too high. He proposed substituting a hypothetical age-sex structure for the figures for the purpose of academic debate. Given such doubt, it is surely possible that the consistent age-sex structures in successive structures may be affected by certain amounts of mutual interdependence between records. A trawl through the evidence reveals decisively that the absolute certainty in any political controversial historical question should never be derived from the academic research or official statistics. Politics always affects the presentation of statistics, and the history of any period tends to be written by the winners. In relation to China, admirers of Mao's socialist policies clearly were not the winners. The approach of modern writers to the Great Leap Forward is absurdly one-sided. They are unable to grasp the relationship between failures and successes. They can only grasp that serious problems occurred during the years 59-61. They cannot grasp that the work that was done in those years also laid the groundwork for the continuing overall success of Chinese socialism in improving the lives of its people. They fail to seriously consider the evidence that indicates most of the deaths that occurred in the Great Leap Forward were due to natural disasters, not policy errors. Besides, the deaths that occurred in the Great Leap Forward have to be set against the Chinese people's successes in preventing many other deaths through the Maoist period. Improvements in life expectancy saved the lives of many millions. We must also consider what would have happened if there had been no leap and no adoption of the policies of self-reliance once the breach with the Soviet Union occurred. China was too poor to allow its agriculture and industrial development to stagnate simply because the Soviets were refusing to help. This is not an argument that things might not have done better. Perhaps with better planning and less optimism and more care, some deaths might have been avoided. This is a difficult question. It is hard to pass judgment what others did in difficult circumstances many years ago. Of course, it is important that we do learn from the mistakes of the past to avoid them in the future. We should note that Mao did criticize himself for the errors made during this period, but this self-criticism should in no way be allowed to give ammunition to those who insist that the truth of ridiculous figures for the numbers that died in this time. Hopefully, there will come a time when sensible debate about these issues will take place. If India's rate of improvement in life expectancy had been as great as China's after 1949, then millions of deaths would have been prevented. Even Mao's critics acknowledge this. Perhaps this means that we should accuse Nehru and others who came after him of being worse than Hitler for adopting non-Maoist policies that led to deaths in the millions. Or perhaps this would be a childish and fantasy way of assessing India's post-independence history, as foolish as the charges that have been leveled against Mao in the last 25 years, maybe.